Good afternoon. I want to welcome Dr. David Strausser and introduce him as our next speaker. He's a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is co-director of the Illinois Center for Transition and Work. He is editor of textbooks related to career development and assessment and rehabilitation, and has authored over 140 articles and chapters related to career development and employment of people with disabilities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Strausser.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and appreciate those of you who are attending. So I know it's getting late in the conference, and it's beautiful weather outside, so very, very understandable. So what I want to talk about today and what I want to introduce is it's a model that we've developed at the University of Illinois that we developed about 10 years ago that we've been using a lot for research related to people with disabilities, the Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model. And what I want to do today is try to start the initial applications to it in terms of loss of earning capacity and how it might apply to more forensic work and applications on the forensic front. So that's my overall goal today. And here's an overview of kind of where we're going to go over the next hour and a half that we have together. Is going to start out and give basic facts about employment with disabilities and employment rate with people with disabilities. And I think probably most of you are well aware of all those issues because this is kind of our customary introduction. I'm going to briefly talk about earning capacity and rehabilitation, talk about a couple models four models that are predominant models in the field, used quite a bit, two of them having some empirical evidence to them. I'm going to then introduce the Illinois Work and Wellbeing Model and kind of give you an overview of what that model is and the major components of it. And then at the end here, for the last bit of the presentation, we're going to take that model and customize it and apply it to forensic analysis related to earning capacity. So given that we're a small group here, if anybody has questions about anything, please, I guess, just we'll ask them as we go along. So I always like to start with this because I think this is always a grounding force for what we do and what we do and why it is important. And that is looking at employment and disability. And work is central to people's lives. And you all know this. It's a very important component of adult well-being. And it's used to help people meet their basic needs. And it leads to better physical and mental health and overall well-being. So take mental health as a subset of well-being, but overall well-being as a whole. And career development is a part of this that's related to maximizing employment and helping people re-enter the labor market. And career development and meeting the demands of work is a behavioral, cognitive, and affective process. So all three of those dimensions come together to help people through the career development process. And as a result of this multidimensional behavioral, cognitive, and affective process, it's influenced by what I call contextual variables that exist outside the individual within their environment, such as things like their family, socioeconomic status, cultural background, economic labor market issues, different things like that. And when we look at the career development process as a whole, we can really break it down into these three components. The awareness, which encompasses things like vocational identity, we'll get to this in just a minute, acquisition, basically how to get a job search, and then maintenance, how do people maintain it. So I have over here kind of the core identity pieces of this. So when I talk about career awareness, and a lot of the research that I do is related to career awareness, looks at vocational identity, career awareness, and work personality, and how those factors are impacted. Acquisition, not a lot of research and rehab done on this, as much as you think it would, have been how critical it is. Job seeking skills, things like impression management, job seeking self-efficacy, and then looking at the maintenance, what's needed to carry out to keep the job. Things like work adjustment is a big part of this, meeting the production demands, conforming to the social work environment, and dealing effectively with the environmental factors such as coworkers and supervisors. So when we look at this, and we look at people who are disengaged from the labor market or underemployed within the labor market, we start to see health factors that impact the individual, such as decreased mental health. We see this in terms of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse quite a bit. Increased mortality, people live less than they would have. Decreased life expectancy, decreased physical health, scarring, which is a lot of research is now coming out on the lasting effects of unemployment and how that impacts people in terms of their physical and psychological well-being. And then also the vicarious unemployment and how that impacts the family in terms of increased abuse and domestic violence rates, divorce, financial strain. Now, where I think this is really relevant for those of you doing forensic analysis is people who become disengaged from the labor market because of an injury or illness or condition are likely to be experiencing these types of conditions. Now, whether any of these become clinical, like a person develops clinical depression or, has a heart attack or something along those lines, that may not be the outcome, but the stress within these systems is all but likely. And the impact and the person having to manage these outcomes are going to impact the individual and their ability to return to work in some capacity. And the scarring is that long lasting effect. And then also this vicarious unemployment, the impact on the family is a very real issue too, that we need to take into consider when we look at how it potentially impacts people's ability to return to work. So I just draw this to your attention in terms of when you're working with an individual in a forensic type capacity, I think it's important to keep these factors in mind of how the loss of work or that disengagement from the labor market may be impacting that person. And hopefully by returning them to work, we see some reduction in these areas. Although research has suggested that scarring and vicarious unemployment are very slow to respond, if they ever respond at all. So those become very real issues. Okay, when we look at the labor market participation rate with people with disabilities, we see that people with disabilities are participating in the employment or the labor market much less than their non-disabled counterparts, which is not surprising. We've known that for a long time. We know here's the number rate of people with disabilities compared to their non-disabled parts in terms of their overall labor market participation. So again, things to keep in mind as we look at it. So with just that as a backdrop, we're going to turn to now earning capacity models. But I think some of the biggest takeaways from what I just introduced there is I would really go back to this slide and really be taking this in terms of how unemployment, whether it's even temporary or even more likely full-time or something along those lines, how that impacts people. And we'll be bringing these issues back when we talk about return to work. Okay, so what I want to do now is kind of give an overview of some earning capacity models that are commonly used in forensic rehabilitation to assess people's earning capacity. So as Robinson notes in his text, which is our primary text right now in terms of forensic vocational analysis, over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase where vocational experts have been called upon to provide expert services in civil litigation. So I know a lot of you probably do Social Security work, but then also the civil litigation of personal injury, medical malpractice, family law, different things along those lines. We're seeing an increased analysis, certainly as laws change around the country in terms of damages that put more emphasis on economic damages. This is going to become a bigger issue and continue to grow. And as a result, it's common for vocational rehabilitation consultants being asked to look at what's the earning capacity of the injured person. So let's start out by defining what we talk about earning capacity. And earning capacity is defined many different ways. I've highlighted 4 here. So one by Dobb in 1993 is a loss of earning capacity is a present or prospective loss of human capital and the opportunity it represents. It's a very good academic technical definition. When we look at Garner, he defined loss of earning capacity as the person's ability or power to earn money, given the person's talent, skills, training, and experience. And then number 3 here is the expected earnings of a worker who chooses to maximize the expectation of actual earnings. And number 4 is Shanasarian's definition of the individual's ability to optimize employment efforts and maximize earnings. So if you take all 4 of these together, they're said different ways, but the core elements across all of them are, it is looking at how the person's skills and abilities and capacity relates to their ability to earn in the labor market. And in a vocational rehab context, we're asked to look at, okay, in a forensic case in civil litigation, is looking at how does a person's injury or illness or condition potentially impact their ability to earn. And there's multiple models that have been used to address that. So as I hear, there's multiple models. Ideally, these models should be free of bias and demonstrate a balanced approach to assessing earning capacity. So the model in and of itself is taking variables that are neutral in value, so to speak, or are assigned value by what people give them, but the model itself has no value. There's 3 models that Robinson notes that have been empirically examined, and they have limited empirical support. So one area that will be areas that would need to expand on in the future will be certainly more analysis. And importantly is related to the model that I'm going to introduce to you today. There has been no model of earning capacity that has taken into account the International Classification of Functioning, the ICF, which is the World Health Organization conceptualization and the globally accepted model for disability and chronic health conditions. So that's important because this really has a tremendous amount of scientific, social scientific, behavioral, medical research behind how that model of functioning is operationalized. Okay. So when we look at select earning capacity models, there's 20 plus models out there, and they're all targeting maybe slightly different things. There's some models that are specifically more for use in workers' compensation settings. I've picked out the models that are more applicable to personal injury and medical malpractice cases. And the first one that I think is very widely used from talking to people is the RAPEL model. And this RAPEL is an acronym that describes 5 domains of analysis related to the vocational functioning of people. So the first one is being the rehabilitation plan. And this component indicates that things like functional limitations, strengths, emotional and cognitive capacities need to be taken into account. And then there needs to be a plan put into place of how to establish employment. So that's step 1. Second step would be to access the vocational or the choices in the labor market, what's available. Placeability gets into the probability of being placed into that job, the old-fashioned definition of placeability there. And then earning capacity, here's where we get our earning capacity component again, is what would, based on the rehabilitation plan, the access and the placeability, what would the person have the ability to earn given the positions that would be available to him or her? And then the last part, the L, is labor force participation, which in this model gets translated into work-life expectancy. So the RAPEL model. Field, that was by Field. Field also talks about this approach, the practical model, which I personally think is the most generalizable model in the sense that it takes into 6 steps, really 5 steps, number 6 is optional, that really lays out in a very sequential manner what vocational rehabilitation consultants are asked to do in civil litigation. And that is to take a look at, establish what the pre-injury earning capacity of the individual was, what the post-injury capacity is based on the person's residual functional capacity, estimate the difference between those, estimate the work-life expectancy, and then take the loss or the difference and multiply it by work-life expectancy, and that's what you get. And if you're able to, reduce it to present day value. In my experience, mostly this is where economists come into play. These 5 steps are really in the wheelhouse of the vocational rehabilitation consultant. and maybe some people would even say work-life expectancy, depending on setting and who you're working with in terms of economic analysis, or if you do it yourself, it would be relevant. But I work a lot with economists, and they tend to want to estimate work-life expectancy for a variety of reasons. So I do it sometimes they do it, and our analysis there wouldn't differ, but some people have preferences on that. Let me back up here. Again, reducing the present day value. I know people do it. I personally just don't think that's really within our wheelhouse as vocational rehabilitation consultants to do reducing things to present day value. But if you do it, that's fine. If you can defend how your process is, that's good. Again, I found more times that economists or forensic accountants, really that's their domain. And really what they need from us is this difference part. Okay. And then a third model here is the earning capacity assessment theory and the earning capacity assessment form. Does anybody here use the earning capacity assessment form by Mike Shanasarian? Okay, so it's a pretty interesting form. It complements the model. But this model gets he's a little bit more parsimonious in his description of it, but it's again to take reviewing. Step one is to review existing evidence, such as things like medical, psychosocial, background factors, develop any new evidence from examination or labor market research, and then formulate the opinion on what the loss of earning capacity is. Now, his big thing is, which if you use ECAF, which I would encourage you at least to look at it, he says that there are 14 factors that are critical into establishing and looking at earning capacity, and 9 of them are inhibitors, which these are things that how people these factors here tend to inhibit or reduce earnings, and then there's drivers, which there are 5 of those that tend to facilitate or drive vocational earning capacity. So his scale has 14 of these, and he has a nice little scoring matrix and interpretation profile that you can use to help guide your analysis. And big thing that he says here, which I think is really important, is the ECAF is not designed to give you an exact analysis and number of what loss is. It's used as a tool to help guide you through your clinical decision-making process, your vocational analysis as it relates to loss of earning capacity. So his model is commonly used. It has been empirically studied. His 14 factors have been derived through some of the research that he has done. He's published it. So it's a model that does have some credibility in terms of looking at empirical value. The last model is developed by Robinson and a couple of his colleagues, the Vocational Rehabilitation Assessment Model, or the VRAM. This is another model that has some empirical research behind it and components behind it. And it's a very comprehensive model. And he has a nice fancy diagram that I did not replicate, but he has a nice good diagram in there. And there's really 3 components of it, 3 steps. And this kind of really, in my opinion, builds off of Field's practical model. It kind of extends it and takes a look at, okay, the first thing is the record review and rehabilitation interview. And this is to gather information about the supply side, which is the individual. What are the factors that are making up the individual? And that could be things like medical treatment, job acquisition, residual functional capacity, behavioral health, the person's work experiences, different things like that. The second step is to look at the labor market research and analysis. So you're going to look at things like labor market statistical information, maybe do some labor market analysis, different things like this to determine how that person's residual or what's going on in the labor market. And then this step 3 here, the rehabilitation analysis and opinion formulation, is where this all gets blended together by taking a look at what is on the supply side, what is on the demand side, and that might involve some additional testing, transferable skills analysis, any future medical that a person might have. And then his big piece here, which I think is really nice, is to engage in hypothesis testing, where different hypotheses regarding earning capacity might get developed and tested, and they then look and develop into an opinion regarding earning capacity, potentially work-life expectancy, and then rehabilitation planning, things that could be done to help that person mitigate damages or to re-enter the labor market. So with that as a basis, those models of earning capacity, good transition now here into talking about the Illinois work and well-being model. And I'm going to start out by introducing it as a whole of a model that we've used now for going on 10 years at Illinois to conduct research related to people with disabilities, and start with giving you the conceptual basis for it and walk you through kind of the model and talk a little bit about some of the applications. So the Illinois work and well-being model is a model that outlines pathways to conceptualize career development of people with disabilities to achieve participation outcomes which lead to well-being. So that's a good academic definition. What it does, provides us a conceptual model to look at the factors and domains that relate to participation in broader society, but also economic well-being. This is a model that has been used, like I said, for about 10 years now in research that we've done, as well as other people have done. And a lot of it has been done in the area of cancer and working with individuals who are cancer survivors. And it's grounded in the ICF. So this is based on the International Classification of Functioning. So that's the model that I was telling you about. That is the model the World Health Organization uses. And it provides a structure and process for vocational analysis. So again, I want to say this is a framework to help do an analysis, where like if you talk about like field with a practical approach, that's a process of things that need to be done. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, do this. This Illinois work and well-being model, when we get to talking about it in terms of a forensic sense, will provide both a process to help kind of make that model, like a field model practical approach, actionable, but provides a structure for us to kind of look at what components need to be analyzed. So here's our model, the Illinois work and well-being model. And what I'm going to do is spend some time to breaking down the 3 domains here, and then talk about which each one of those are and how it potentially, how they interact with each other. And like any good model, here we have arrows going all over the place, as you see, and they all have bidirectional arrows, which we put bidirectional arrows because we know that impact in one area tends to impact another area, and that tends to go both ways. So, and then we have a hashed line here too of an intervention. And we'll talk about the interventions in a little bit. Will not be a primary focus of my talk today, is the intervention. And then just recently, within the last couple of years, we've added this as an outcome, well-being. It was always in there in the model, but we've really now taken it out and made it an end piece, so to speak. It was always implied. The model has always been the Illinois work and well-being model, so well-being was always implied, but we brought it out and took it out here and made it a separate component. So what is it? It consists of 3 domains, and the first domain is the contextual domain. And the contextual domain has 3 components to it. These 3 components are implicated in the ICF and are consistent with the ICF. And the first one is personal. And these are personal factors, and there's 12 of them, and there can be more. I want to be clear. This is not necessarily, this is an exhaustive list of personal factors. This is 12 traits that I tend to look at, but there are certainly more that people can look at. So this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a good 12 to start your analysis of it. And these are factors that are related to health habits and lifestyle. Research has shown that sociodemographic factors, cognitive, emotion, motivation, personality, satisfaction, coping, social relationships. So these are factors that research in the area of health and well-being have indicated that are personal factors that tend to be related to health-related outcomes and health-related well-being. So we have that broken down into 12. And then if we move on to the next one, we have environmental factors. And environmental factors are a little bit broader. This is really almost anything outside of the individual. Things that were commonly analyzed in research related to health would be culture, socioeconomic, legal issues, family constellation, communities in which people live in, and then also transportation. Transportation is a global issue. I have not been a place in the world I have not been to Antarctica or Africa, but outside of those places, transportation is an issue, and I'm going to assume in Africa and Antarctica it is as well. So transportation tends to be a major component when we look at environmental factors. But again, culture, socioeconomic factors, legal issues, family and community tend to be big ones that look at, and research has shown are primary drivers of the outcomes in related to health. One thing I like to look at too is we look at social network, which would be like family and community, is to operationalize it by using these four things: size, range, composition, and density. And due to the sake of time, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on it, but it's important to look at what's the size of the person's network. That obviously size, range, how broad is it? How many people are in it? Composition is who's in it, like what type of people are in it. For most of us in this room, we have probably a fairly broad composition of people in our network, not just, vocational experts or something like that. We have other people that we bring into it. And then the density is where do they live in proximity to each other, and what is the size of that network geographically. Then the last part here of the contextual domain is functioning. And to me, functioning you can break down into four key components of how people function. And every health condition that a person experiences is going to impact these four things. It's going to impact their physical functioning, how people communicate. And when we look at communication, we can look at that in terms of both expression and reception. So how people can express themselves and how they can receive information. We look at the emotional functioning, how the people function emotionally, and cognitively, how, again, people cognitively function. And I use more of a broader term many of the times, executive functioning, as a way to incorporate that. Now, all four of those factors tend to interact with each other. So that is our functioning factor. And before I move on to talk about the career domain, what you see here is that we operationalize it as each one of these things: personal factors, environmental factors, and limitations. They all impact each other. And that's really a key part to this, is this bidirectional nature of how people, what happens in one area, what happens in the environment might impact people personally, might impact their limitations. And what happens in their limitations may definitely impact, again, how the, yes. Age would be a personal factor, in my opinion. Early in my life, when I was young, for a song, I was thinking about a chili dog outside. Right. Yeah. There you go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's I think you're answering your question, is you have to take account of people's human development, how they grow over time and how they change over time, and how it may impact some of these other factors, like how does age impact physical functioning? How does it impact the person's interaction with the environment? We'll talk about this later too, how it impacts the different career pieces as well. Age is a personal factor that's already in there. Yeah, and it's going to change as all this evolves. This is the beauty of this, and the demise of this model is nothing stagnant, because everything is always changing. So, all right. When we look at the career domain, as I mentioned to you, we have three dimensions to this. We have awareness, and traditional things within the awareness domain are vocational identity, career awareness. Sometimes people call that career maturity, as well as vocational maturity. Career awareness tend to be sometimes used simultaneously, and work personality. And these are all things that relate to how does a person see themselves related to the work environment. And within that, we see these contextual factors are going to impact awareness. So as something changes over here, that is going to impact how people think about themselves here. Okay. In the next phase, let me go back here. The next phase is the next factor is acquisition. And this is job seeking skills, impression management, job seeking self-efficacy. And again, my bias would be is that this is probably one of the more understudied areas in the area of vocational rehabilitation. Even in personnel resource management, it's probably not as studied as it should be. We look at that. And then maintenance, and this is the work adjustment, being able to carry out required job tasks, meet production demands, conform to the social demands of work, and engage effectively with coworkers. Now, this too, again, has these bidirectional arrows going between them, because what happens in one area is definitely going to impact how, within one factor might impact how a person perceives themselves or related to another factor. A great example would be, let's say a person is conducting a job search and they're not experiencing very good results of the job search. That might impact their vocational identity, have a negative impact on their vocational identity. Conversely, we know from a lot of career development research that people who have stronger vocational identity, more clarity about where they fit into the labor market, tend to conduct better job searches and have better results. The last piece here is maintenance, and I mentioned this work adjustment. This to me is a good classic work adjustment model. You could look at Hershensen's model, Minnesota theory of work adjustment model, but the core concept of maintenance is looking at how people are able to meet the demands of work and work as it changes and the job as it evolves over time. And then the last bit of this is participation. And what this model is leading to here is what happens in the contextual domain impacts what happens in the career domain, which impacts how people participate in society. And according to the ICF, there's really four major societal domains or four major participation domains. And that is how people function in their home, how people function in society, and social relationships. This should be more personal. I should clear this up. This should be more personal, social, intimate relationships, broader community, and then their work. So these are four major outcomes that are related to how people participate. And then what we've done in the model is say, okay, contextual domains impact career domains, impact participation, which impacts how people perceive their well-being. Obviously, when people are participating more in activities, are able to participate, derive more meaning from it, they are going to have a higher level of well-being. When people aren't participating like they'd like to, or are limited in their ability to participate, they're going to experience decreased well-being. So with that said, that is the Illinois work and well-being model as a whole. And we've conducted, other people have conducted studies related to health and well-being and career development for people with chronic health conditions ranging from multiple sclerosis, cancer, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, different things like that. And it's been used as a way to formulate and conceptualize the factors that are being examined. Okay, so we're going to reapply this now to earning capacity. So this is just, I give you a lot of visual cues here because I'm a visual person myself. I like to see the model. So this is the model from we're working from, and now we're going to apply it to earning capacity assessment. How do we assess a person's earning capacity? And several things have changed here, obviously, that are worth noting. Is first of all, on the contextual side, that has not changed. Those factors are there. What has changed as we look at it is the career development piece, and streamline this a little bit to include really now what I would say when we look at earning capacity, there's three career domains that need to be, or career factors that need to be examined. Is that's analyzing the employability of the person, the placeability of the person, and then the maintenance. So how does a person's skills and abilities translate to the labor market? Can they be placed in jobs? Are jobs available for them? And then if they get that job, can they maintain it? That impacts their participation, and that ultimately impacts their earning capacity or their ability to earn wages within the labor market. So this is now the model that's been transposed to look at assessing earning capacity with these changes in these four areas, these three factors here, and then this outcome variable. So in this model, how do we define earning capacity? It's the definition. It's a little bit different definition than you saw from the previous four, but overall it's the same type of concept. It is earning wages for positions an individual has the capacity to perform. So we're going to go with that definition, which I think encompasses fairly the other 4 definitions that we talked about earlier. An earning capacity is equal to the impact of the person's context, the career development and participation, or the interaction of these. So still, as we're looking at this model and trying to develop this model and fine tune this model, kind of looking at are these additive effects or the interaction effects, and we're kind of looking at them both ways right now. But basically, the earning capacity is the interaction of these 3 factors or these 3 domains and how it impacts earnings. And again, the factors that were there in each domain. Okay. So what has changed in the model? And what's changed in the model is looking at the employability, the placeability, and the maintenance, and how are we defining that? And I think it's important that we look at how we define this model. First thing we want to look at is employability. Oh, sorry. Employability. And the way I'm looking at employability here in this model would be certainly the person's vocational identity and how that vocational identity pre-injury, what was the vocational identity pre-injury, what's the vocational identity post-injury, and then their educational skills, what skills do they develop through the education that they attained, and then content skills. And I really incorporated here Power's definition of skills. He defines 3 types of skills. He talks about content skills, adaptive skills, and functional skills. And you'll see down here that I have adaptive and functional skills down here in maintenance. And I'll tell you why I have those down there when we get there. But so when I look at employability, the thing to look at is how does a person's identity, their education, and their skills, how does that impact their ability to earn? How does that impact their participation first? And how does that impact their ability to earn? The second component is to look at their placeability. And that really is looking at, how can the person obtain a job in the labor market? And that's related to not only their job seeking skills, but also their motivation and their work propensity is a good term that Mike Shanasaran uses a lot, work propensity, the person's attachment, the person's drive to be part of the labor market. And then the last part here is maintenance, which is, yes. Well, there's a lot of research on motivation and a lot of ways that people talk about motivation. So motivation is a complex subject. The way I define motivation is the person motivated to get a job? Is the person motivated to be part of the labor market? Are they, go ahead. Well, you could use motivation, you could measure it several ways. You could use like the work motivation scale if that's what you wanted to use. You could use your clinical judgment. I'm not putting in specific assessments for you to use. You can use your own assessments. There are, like I said, work motivation scale is a commonly one used in academic research to assess work motivation. I think probably most rehab experts assess motivation through their own clinical assessment. Good clinical interview can get a lot at motivation. But more we operationalize it, the better. So do you use a particular scale or? Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. And I think you bring, so you said something there I think is pretty important on behavioral observation or on motivation is when you look at behavioral science and there is good research to suggest that behavioral observation can indicate a lot of a person's motivation, but it is not, perfect method. Scales, like I mentioned, the work motivation scale is something that can be used. But if this was, when we get into like the pre-injury profile, because we'll get into pre-injury and post-injury profile, how I would assess motivation on a pre-injury profile would be how engaged has this person been in the labor market? How many times are they changing jobs? How many times, have they been fired? How many times have they left because they got a disagreement with the boss? They have very unstable job history. And there's certain jobs, for example, like in Memphis, Tennessee, where you have shipping and receiving, that people work temporary jobs all the time to engage in shipping and receiving, change employers all the time. That's a little bit different. But that's where your professional expertise comes in to how you assess motivation and what factors we look at. To me, I would look at the work history. I would look at their demonstrated work history, how engaged they've been, how often they've been absent from the labor market, and how long they've been absent from the labor market. That's a good question on motivation. Maybe come back next year and have a talk on assessing motivation in forensic settings. And then the last part here too is work adjustment or maintenance. And I think there's three things here that I bring into play. Work adjustment, we just developed a scale at the University of Illinois called the Illinois Work Adjustment Scale, published in Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation. We've used it a lot in research related to cancer survivors quite a bit. And we've broken it down into two subtests: context, the person's ability to manage the environment, coworkers, stressful situations on the work in the work environment, get along with people. We call that context, where we call capacity. Does the person have the ability to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, maintain regular work attendance, not need to take excessive breaks and different things along those lines? And that scale, the Illinois Work Adjustment Scale, measures that. But even if you don't use that scale to measure it, I would break it down into two components: people's ability to measure deal with the context, and then the people's ability to meet the demands of work in terms of what's expected of the work environment. And then bringing the other two Hirschen's or power scales here, or adaptive skills and functional skills. So we talked about content skills. These are skills that belong to specific jobs, specific tasks within the labor market. Adaptive skills are the skills and personality factors and different things like that, that deals with how a person is able to deal with what I call the context. And the functional skills are very similar to that too. Is functional skills are how does a person able to relate to the data, people, and things that are common within the work environment. So this is what we look at in terms of maintenance. So when we look at this, what this model suggests is when we look at people's earning capacity, we have to assess what are their skills and work experiences and how do they relate to the labor market? Can the person get a job? And then can the person keep a job? And I think those are all three factors that vocational analysts use and look at in determining a person's earning capacity, certainly before the injury and after the injury. And then the last bit, we've tweaked this a little bit too when we look at earning capacity. We've made it a little bit more streamlined. We've basically asked 4 questions you can look at. What's the person's ability to live independently and function independently? Oh, sorry about that. Can the person fulfill customary societal roles? Can the person maintain personal and intimate relationships? And can the person, what is their demonstrated work history? So to me, these kind of tend to all go together, with demonstrated work history tending to impact personal relationships, society, and home. As I tell my students, you bring a boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other home who's not employed and has no ambition, that usually doesn't go over well with the parents, and soon probably doesn't go over well with the person who's dating that person as well. So work tends to have a main factor in that. So which relates again to how people fulfill this. So this is kind of our points of analysis that will all impact earning capacity. So as we bring this together, what I'm going to do now is take this and put this into a pre-injury and post-injury profile and kind of walk you through what I would do. And let me just caution as we move forward here, this is not a final product yet. This is a project in works. So, this is something that I'm developing, and in the process of analyzing and assessing. But the basic concept, again, of earning capacity or loss of earning capacity assessment is, what did the person have the capacity to earn prior to the injury? And what do they have the capacity to earn after the injury? So by applying this model, it allows us to build pre-injury and post-injury profiles. So again, here's our model. And here is now a model that we've taken and assigned some values to the different traits. And what I've done here is I've used a scoring model based on the ICF that looks at these things as either being facilitators or barriers. So facilitators are things, using Shanasarian's works, are drivers that tend to be producing good outcomes. Barriers would be things that are inhibitors or tend to depreciate outcomes. And what have done is made this a 3-level scale from +1, 0, and -1, trying to keep it very simple. And what we've done is, or what I have done, I should say, is assign value to the factors and the subcomponents of each factor. And so, for example, on personal factors, I'm suggesting at this time that you look more at their personal factors as a whole. All those 12 personal factors, kind of put those all together and say, okay, from a personal perspective, is the person prior to their injury, the pre-injury capacity, was that personal factor a facilitator? Did it help them get better outcomes? Was it neutral, something that wasn't helping them or hurting them? Or was it an inhibitor? So that would be kind of the range on that. And then look at the limitations. And that coincides with this little component up here. So as I mentioned about limitations, I break them down into 4 areas: physical, cognitive, emotional, and communication. I give a value for each one of those. Was there communication, a barrier or a facilitator or neutral? Was there physical functioning, the same, barrier, facilitator, neutral? Was there emotional functioning, barrier, facilitator, or neutral? And the same with their cognitive functioning. And that's why then this little box here score ranges from -4 to 4. Okay. And then I did the same thing down here for environmental factors. I used environmental factors as a whole to look at, okay, what's the person's environment, all those things, the cultural aspects, the economic aspects, different things like that. How is that impacting in terms of their impacting their earning capacity? Is it a facilitator, a barrier, or neutral? So that's how I score the contextual domain. And then the career domain is a lot of where the action is, obviously, and I've broken it down into assigning values to the 4 components that I've talked about. Three factors with sub-factors. So employability, identity, educational skills, and content skills. So did the person have good vocational identity prior to the injury? Was their education a strength? Was their work skills a strength? For placeability, what was their motivation? Was it a strength, neutral, or a weakness? Their work propensity, their attachment to work, their ability to connect to the work environment, and their job seeking skills. And then on the maintenance part, was their work adjustment, negative, neutral, or a facilitator? Same with their adaptive skills and their functional skills. And so all those things there, if you look at it, if they're all ones, you're going to get a score of 19. If they're all negative ones, you're going to get a score of -19. Now, let me suggest where we're going with scores, and the scoring model is being tweaked and finalized. But a very basic way to interpret this is look at, okay, if it's a 1, then it's a facilitator. So this person prior to the injury, these things we'd be considering strengths. If we have a 0 by them, then we'd say this was neutral. This wasn't helping or hurting the person. And if we have a negative by it, this was hurting the person or being a barrier prior to the injury already. So this is the process for constructing the pre-injury profile. And how I would interpret it, and let me really be strong here and say this, the interpretation is still something that we're working on. So this is just, we're giving you like general guides at this point, is, as I mentioned now multiple times, score of 1's a facilitator, scores a 0, you got a -1. And these scores can range from a high of 38 to a low of -38. And that's, I should say, that's the difference score. That's the difference score. And that's where we're still working on the scoring a little bit. And starting to where I want to go with it is kind of get it to look at the percentage of change pre and post. from pre-injury to post-injury. So I got some models worked up a little bit where I've started to do that, but again, it's being tweaked and it's not in its final set. But really important, what I don't want to have happen and what the model is not designed to do is say, okay, if the person has a 70% change in functioning from pre and post-injury, that equates to a 70% loss of earning capacity. That's not the case. Okay, so that is not the right way to use this percentage. What that does tell us, though, is we have 70%. We could say this person has a pretty severe vocational impairment, or pre-injury. If we look at things, this person had very good. If a person had like 19 or 17 pre-injury profile, this person had a very good profile to start out with. There was a lot of strengths. Okay, we'll get into this here in just a minute. I'll skip over this. And then here's a template that I'm developing to kind of guide you in putting this together. Again, I should have draft open for discussion kind of across this thing, so it's not, don't go use it and say that this is ready to go. Yeah, we're getting there. And my concept is to develop kind of a pre-injury. How was a person doing in these areas? And then post-injury, what was a person doing in those areas? And then what's the difference scores? And those difference scores really allow us to look at, okay, from pre and post-injury, we'll talk about post-injury in just a minute. Where do we see change? Change either for the better, change for the worse. And when we see that change, how is that impacting a person's earning capacity? So for example, in environmental components, if we look at a person's family, prior to the injury, maybe the family was a significant strength. Now, after the injury, that's been impacted. There's been a lot of financial strain, a lot of marital stress. Is that gone down to a 0? Or has that gone down to a -1? Or is this a family that's staying tight, staying strong, and continuing to do well? Yes. Thinking about it, we're getting there. So obviously where we look at going is inter-rater reliability and consistency, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the way that would be laid out from a research perspective would be have clinicians look at the same case and how much deviation do we get. And we wouldn't expect anybody to have the exact same scores, but how tight is that band of score difference? So I might be calling on you next to maybe help me with some of those studies. That would be good. So another important part here too is I've looked at totaling here the domain total. So pre-domain total, post-domain, and then difference. And this can be done, you can analyze, in my opinion, multiple ways. Certainly items are where a lot of the action is if you want to get really specific. You could also step out and look at the domains and see what changes happen in the domains. Did the contextual domain stay the same, or was there minimal loss, or was there significant loss or significant change? And then we do that same thing here for the career factors and the participation factors. Now, what I don't have out here is earning capacity, because I've taken that off the sheet. My rationale for that is because this needs to be, explored and analyzed based on the results of this form. Again, you as a clinician are going to take this change and look at these factors and then use this as a guide to determine what earning capacity was or is. So now, post-injury capacity here. So slightly different. If one thing you notice here is we bring back interventions. Same scheme, pre and post-injury, you can look at the score. But one thing that can be factored in your analysis, not in the scoring template itself, but in the analysis to look at earning capacity, is interventions now that can be used to help deal with facilitators, barriers, leverage those to help earning capacity, or for a person to mitigate damages, or a person to re-enter the labor market. So those could be things like assistive technology, alternative work schedules, returning to part-time work, different things like that. acquiring additional credentials. These are all things that can be intervention points that are going to impact this model. But what we do here again, as I mentioned, is now you've developed a pre-injury profile. Now you go develop the post-injury profile and you look at the differences and it gives you an idea, okay, where is this person losing? Where is this person gaining? Where has there been changes? Where have there not been any changes? And then how might that potentially impact a person's earning capacity? All right. Now, I'm going to step back here for just a minute and go more into a career development exercise here too. But it's important related to the intervention piece. One thing that we have found in this model, and as we've studied this pretty extensively, is that we call this cross-domain interaction, cross-factor, cross-domain interaction, which means what happens in one area can impact what happens in another area. This is not necessarily a linear path. These tend to be bidirectional. We've done a lot of research to show for like young adult cancer survivor. If I go back and show you the original model, we look at career identity, career awareness. As cancer comes along, that decreases, which then impacts their personal factors. And we've shown that bidirectional relationship. So as a clinician, when you're talking about analyzing pre and post-injury profiles, you need to have some discussion and some analysis of how does a change potentially over here impact these things. Vocational identity might impact personal factors, which might impact how a person functions, or how a person functions might impact their personal factors, different things like that. So just kind of won't get into that a lot today. Maybe I'll come back next year and talk about that in a little bit more detail in a career context, but this is something we're really finding at the University of Illinois and other people around the world have found too, that these changes in one tends to go across domains, cross factors, and that's really where the analytics come in and your clinical skills come in to say, okay, how do we work with this person and what interventions are the best? For example, we can't just say assistive technology is going to be a great intervention for everybody who has some communication problems. Because we know, for example, people who live in lower socioeconomic statuses, environments, or there might be family stigma related to an assistive technology device, aren't going to use their assistive technology devices. We know that research has widely suggested that that is the case. All right, so here's a case example that I've developed to just kind of highlight this. And this is not a true case in any way. This is just kind of to help us see the model come to life here with some numbers. So 42-year-old high school educated male who's worked as a conductor for 10 years. Based on my experience, conductors around the United States start out making about $120,000 a year. High school educated, most of them. Great job for high school educated people. So this person then has an L4, L5, and then also in the lumbar area and also a C4, C5 in the cervical area, disc herniation. And we can just say those required surgery and the person's had surgery on both their neck and back. As a result, they're limited now to light work. In addition, they've developed a single episode of major depressive disorder, which is mild. As a result, as I mentioned, they're previously earning 120. Post-injury, there's significant relationship and family stress as a result of the injury. And then I mentioned the financial stress down here as well. So to me, this is a fairly typical case. Certainly there's more details in each case, but this kind of gives me to be general benchmarks of things that I would be seeing in cases. Here's our interpretation guide. Again, I keep showing you the same things again, but so here's what a so-called completed diagnostic form might look like. And so what I did is gave the person all ones for pre-injury. The person was a high functioning individual in terms of personal factors were sound, physical factors were sound, cognitive, communication, emotional, environmental. All the career stuff was solid and all the home stuff was solid. Or participation domains were solid. So this person's pre-injury total score was 19. So we'd say that this person is pretty high functioning, not high functioning, person prior to the injury was functioning well. I'm not going to say that a score of 1 means that this person was high functioning. A score of 1 would mean that this person was functioning, doing good, meeting their job requirements. And then what I did is I went through and kind of highlighted and changed the scores based on some of the things that I would have typically seen in cases. Personal factors remain unchanged. Physical is down, now a negative instead of a positive. Cognitive is a 0. It's gone down to being neutral. You can kind of see how I filled this in. The environmental factors I gave a 0. I think could have maybe even given -1 if you wanted to. But again, this is where your clinical interpretation comes in of how much that's impacting a person. And then I kind of did the same things here. Gave them identity, educational skills, and context skills. This now is an area that's gone more neutral. Person has skills, person still has a high school education. Those are strengths, but not as much of a strength as it was before when the person wasn't relegated to light work. Again, not that it's debilitating or insurmountable, but it changes for them a little bit, in my opinion. Person was still highly motivated. I put them as highly motivated, good work history. Their job seeking skills I took down to neutral because person still knows how to maybe go out and get a job, but now they're being forced to look outside of it. Instead of looking at a bid sheet for where I place myself on the railroad, I'm now having to look at other things. And the work adjustment in the maintenance area, I put down to a neutral as well, because I figured the person was functioning pretty well within their given domain of the railroad. When they're asked to look outside of the railroad, they're going to maybe have a little bit more of a problem, but it's not a liability. Okay. And then I looked over here at their home and societal and kind of went neutral on these, and then work I put down as a -1. As a result, their score is a -18. So that's a 38-point difference here, or a 37-point difference between their pre-injury profile and their post-injury profile. Now, this is what I'm still working on here, so don't take this as don't read into this. In fact, I should probably just scrape this out. It's a 37% or 37-point difference. I'm still working on multiple ways to profile that. What I did here, which isn't necessarily accurate, is a 76-point potential difference. So if somebody was -2s on all the differences, their max score would be a -38. And if they were all +2s, so everybody actually went from being the worst and then they get better to a positive, would be +38. That would be a 76-point difference. But anyways, I'm still kind of working on this. That's not necessarily the best representation. But I think what is representative is this is a 37-point difference between how the person's functioning before and how the person's functioning after. And then when I looked at this and said, okay, here was the pre-injury capacity. Based on a previous case that I was involved in, the high school educated guy who's an electronics technician said, yeah, he can't go and be a conductor anymore, but he can go be an electronics technician. And within the area there of Western Illinois, right outside the St. Louis area, Belleville, a person with that type of degree can make $50,000. So simple math there is that's a $70,000 loss in earning capacity. So this is kind of how I use the worksheet here. The worksheet doesn't tell me the dollar amounts, but it gives me some way to look at what I'm going to call the magnitude of the impact and how it impacts a person, and how and particularly too where the skills have changed. For example, personal factors, I'm going to try to leverage that as a strength and return to work. Emotional, that's not good. We want to try to strengthen that. Maybe the person's in therapy, getting some treatment. Communication for right now would be neutral, not any loss. In the cognitive, there's a slight depreciation there. And some of these other areas, again, really working with them on these type of areas might be really important. For example, an intervention for this gentleman might be to put him back into school, to help him acquire some additional skills. The work adjustment skills, maybe work with him on some work readiness skills that translate over to other more light, non-manual labor type jobs. And then look at here how he's maybe processing his loss of work and what it means to him. So just kind of benchmarking this like Shanasarian does on his ECAF, he doesn't translate specific scores to particular severity, but uses a range here of zero, no loss at all to 100% being catastrophic. Kind of where, based on this analysis, would you place this person's level of impairment? And I'm just kind of saying right now, based on my read of that sheet, where I see this is person has some impairment, it's moderate, it's kind of right here in the middle. Person will have some loss, but the person definitely can continue to experience work, should probably work and continue to work. So that's kind of where that's going. Yes. Well, now let me clarify. This is based on an actual case I did. The guy did have an electronics technician degree. He was a high school educated guy, had some training in electronics. So yeah. Okay. All right. Right. I swiped his scale as far as severity on the ECAF. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so how I would teach students at the University of Illinois on this to look at mild, moderate, severe regarding health conditions, not loss of earning capacity. Would be mild would be there's just minimal impairment, just enough to cause some impairment. You know, moderate and severe are kind of in the middle, where with a range there of some more significant impairment. Moving up to severe would be moderate amount, and then extreme would be can't work at all, or is limited to sedentary work, or significant earnings less, like down to $15 an hour or something like that. Mhm. Yeah, I think that'd be really good for us to be able to look at that, and that's something that we could do statistically by when I clean this up a little bit down here, where we can start to look at a range, we can normally distribute it. We can normally distribute it and say, okay, here's the upper extreme, and here's our moderate, and here's our middle range. So I think that would be the way that I would go on this, tackling that, is distribute the scores to look at a mild, moderate, and severe, where this would mimic the bell curve. Yeah, so we could do that. Well, we can definitely do that, but using scaling, we can scale the scores to fit our model that we want to prescribe, whether it's 5 variables or 4 variables or different things like that. So this tends to be, in my opinion, a very usable scale: mild, moderate, severe, extremely severe, with our anchors of no loss and catastrophic. So I think that would be good to continue to use. And I think then, like I said, we could probably give some guidance. What I'm afraid of is if I say 48%, well, somebody will then take, that's a 48% loss of earnings, which that's a hard no. That's like, no, we got to then extrapolate that and say, okay, this person has a moderate impairment. How does that impact them? And that loss of earning capacity could be very different based on their skill sets, their labor market participation, and the skills that they acquired. Right. 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 Yep. Yeah. Mhm. Right. Right, and I appreciate that. What I'd like to give you down the road here would be something you could say, okay, 48% is moderate because we've normed it and distributed, and we know that 48% is a moderate impairment. That then needs to be contextualized to the specific environment that the person is and where they're being applied. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Sure. I don't think I think you could do that with how we're talking about scaling it, because that's the intervention piece. Let me go back here, because sure. Right. But to your point here too, we can have an issue where we could say there's a 48% and that translates to a moderate, and with no remediation at all, that would translate to this dollar loss here. Okay. To your question is then absolutely you could take into consideration and ask what interventions could be employed, what additional training could be employed, what other things could be done for that person to mitigate the damages or do the due diligence to help mitigate damages. And that can be a question. And that's where you're going to play with certain things like interventions to that to say, okay, what would those interventions do? How much do they cost? Is it worth it? You know, is it worth it to spend $15,000 to send somebody to school to take their loss from post-injury wage from $50,000 to $65,000? It might be. Mhm. Yeah. I'm not going to disagree with you on that, but this model does not address that. So this model is agnostic to what should be done in terms of remediation or different things like that. It depends on the questions that are being asked and what's being looked at. I mean, certainly you could look at that and say, what would a person, you know, rehabilitation be if that was a question that somebody was asking? Yes. That's a really good point, and I think probably I would take that. I would agree with you, so I would take that out. And we could say maybe loss in functioning or loss in come up with a different term. So I agree with you. That's a confusing term. Yeah, I agree. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Right. 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 Thank you. That's exactly what I want it to be. You've just said it. It is a tool. And I think Mike Shanassarian does the same thing with the ECAF. The ECAF does not put a dollar value on something. It helps us as clinicians look and say, this is maybe the level of impairment and how a person might be impaired. That's the exact same thing that I'm trying to do here. but giving a little bit more detail with a numerical expression that looks at change. Like one thing I think is a problem with the ECAF, in my opinion, and I use the ECAF, is it doesn't allow us to profile pre-injury versus post-injury. What I've tried to do here is give a framework that says we can look at how the person was doing pre-injury, how they're doing post-injury, but you as the expert have to translate that into earning capacity, which is why I agree with this gentleman over here. We're going to now change earning capacity to, it helps us determine earning capacity, but it does not, we shouldn't say that the model is determining necessarily. I think we leave that as earning capacity, but not say that it's having numbers directly translate to an earning capacity percentage. Yes. Right. This tool should guide your assessment of earning capacity and give you something to say, look at, when I looked at this person pre-injury, there wasn't very much limitations. I look at the person post-injury, now I see limitations in these areas. And then based on my clinical experience and my workup, why change in these areas is relevant and the magnitude of the change is impactful on their earning capacity. That's what I would hope you'd be able to get out of it. In a way that you could express, like, why are you bringing this and why are you bringing that? And well, I can look back here and say, this is how the person was doing before. This is how the person's doing now. There's a change. And you still have to explain why did you go from, I just know what this becomes, why did you go from a 1 to a 0? Why did you go from 1 to a -1? You're going to have to explain that. Right. Yeah, so how I would answer that's a really good point. A lot of what I would be doing pre-injury is what they're self-reporting, because you probably don't have medical records, and sometimes you might, of what their pre-injury functioning was. That might be relevant too if you have a person who's had multiple injuries or something like that. Then post-injury, I would suggest to do what like Rick Robinson suggests in his model, and Chassarian suggests in his model, and Tim Field talks about it as well, is based on a review of the medical records, the testing, and different things like that, where do we see that there's changes? Sure. Absolutely. Now, if you want to, the way to counter that, if you want to do it, and somebody will pay you to do it, is go reconstruct their pre-injury profile pretty empirically. But you do have more things that can be pre-injury, like the person, is making their mortgage, has a house and a mortgage. If they have a demonstrated work history, they've been married 30 years, 25 years, they have never been arrested, never, these are things that you can start to say, okay, I feel pretty comfortable that this person, is functioning pretty good in those areas, and that's how I would defend it. It's like, well, what you say, these environmental factors, why, how'd you come up with a 1 before? Well, he lived in a pretty nice house, nice neighborhood, was active in his church, kids were going to school, but to either point, I mean, I think where this is not going to walk through you and give you the answers to each thing. You're going to have to use this framework as a guide. This is where this is a guide. Yeah. Good questions. Other questions? Comments on it? So future directions, I've now got more future directions. Okay, good. Thank God, 10 minutes. I was like, I'm sweating up here. I'm like, how am I going to be up here for an hour and a half? My God, I'm used to talking 45 minutes. Like, I'm like, oh, wow. So at least I've made it, what, 120? I've made it minute 20. Wow, okay. Or hour 20. So that's good. All right, so what are the future directions? And in all sincerity, I really appreciate people's feedback on this. I've been walking up with some future directions, changing the names here. I think the scoring needs to be tweaked. And I think really a follow-up to this is really to your suggestions in the middle here, your comments, really making it clear that this is not, my biggest fear is just a linear, 48 means this, and then everybody wants that because it's defendable. It's like, the manual tells me this, it's this, that's why it is. this is a clinical judgment tool. So, but how can we make it cleaner and tighter? And I really appreciate your comments over here on scaling in terms of, getting some normal distributions and looking at guides for the percentages. So we'll continue research related to the career development and earning capacity. I think one of the strengths of the model, again, is that this model is not just developed for forensic analysis. It has been widely used, continues to be used. We have a lot of research going on around the world with it. Continued instrument development. My description for the presentation said I'll be talking about these scales. I decided not to get them talked about too much, but Illinois Work Adjustment Scale was published in Journal of Vocational Rehab, and Illinois Brief Functioning Scale will be coming out pretty soon as well in the Journal of Voc Rehab if you are interested in using those scales. And then some current research that we're doing that I think is pretty exciting in a career area is looking at which domains and which factors tend to impact things the most. So we're starting to look at some studies to look at which ones tend to impact things the most. So that's where we're going with that. So